Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. I
Yeah,
think you guys are really going to like this one. Today, we're going to be looking at declassified CIA documents.
always a fun time.
Always a fun time.
Yeah,
Yeah. We're specifically going to be looking at this paper called Analysis and Assessment of Gateway Process.
that's right. Yeah. So it's
Analysis and Assessment of Gateway Process. This is a paper
a wild one.
that's really out there, right?
Yeah.
It's very it's very technical at times.
Very technical.
But we're going to break it down
Yeah, we'll make it make sense.
as best we can
Absolutely.
and talk about what the CIA was interested in when they were looking at this paper, and what they concluded as well. So
Yeah, and why they were so interested in consciousness,
yeah,
which I think is really the big takeaway here.
absolutely.
So
Why were they?
why were they so interested in consciousness?
Yeah.
So
Well, let's jump right in. Yeah. So the paper starts by examining brain stimulation and resonance. And they give this kind of biomedical model.
Mm.
And what really kind of stuck out to you about this section?
well, I mean, like the most interesting thing is just the concept of resonance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the model that they're presenting here is that basically when you have a deeply relaxed body,
Mm.
it creates a coherent vibration at a very specific frequency range, which is 7 to 7.5 hertz.
Mm-hmm.
And that interacts with the fluid-filled ventricles, which are just above your brainstem. And that interaction creates an electromagnetic pulse.
Wow.
Going
Okay.
with that.
So that's interesting that it's 7 to 7.5 hertz because that's the resonant frequency of the Earth, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. It's very specific.
Yeah.
It's not just a random number. It actually implies that there's like a fundamental connection between the human body and the Earth,
Right.
at least at those frequencies.
Right. Okay, so this pulse then goes on to affect our brain waves,
Right.
And this causes an increase in amplitude and frequency of the brain waves.
Right. Yeah, and they even mentioned Dr. Itzhak Denthoff and his observations on the effects of hemisync tapes, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know if you've ever messed around with those,
I have,
But-
not extensively.
but I've listened to them before.
Yeah, they're pretty wild.
Yeah.
So basically the idea is that, like your body itself is kind of like a finely tuned vibrational system.
Uh-huh.
And it has this subtle micro motion that's happening all the time
Okay.
at a very specific frequency range, 0.6, 0.8, 7.5 hertz.
Okay.
So it's like, we're constantly vibrating at this very low frequency.
So you're saying that's not just like a heartbeat or,
No, it's even more subtle than that.
even more so.
Yeah, it's like a micro motion of all the cells in your body.
Okay.
And Bentoff's work suggests that this energy isn't just contained within the individual.
But it's actually transferred to the Earth's ionospheric cavity,
Uh-huh.
which also resonates at a similar frequency range.
Okay, so
There's like this,
we're like a tuning fork
Yeah.
that's setting off the
the Earth is a bigger tuning fork.
Earth.
Yeah, and we're the little tuning fork.
Yeah.
And we're both kind of vibrating together.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, he even talks about this very long wavelength signal that travels globally in the electromagnetic field.
Okay.
And this signal is huge, like 40,000 kilometers,
Wow.
which is basically the circumference of the Earth,
Uh-huh.
and it passes through most materials without any impedance.
Wow.
So he's like, wouldn't this make a really effective medium for transmitting a telepathic signal?
Right. Yeah.
It's like, that's a pretty big statement right there.
Yeah, it is. So then, okay, so what does all this have to do with the gateway process? So what is the gateway process even trying to do?
Well, so that's a really important question, right? Like, what are the goals of Gateway? And the paper indicates that it's designed to achieve a few things very rapidly,
Okay.
like inducing a state of profound calm, lowering blood pressure, and most importantly, synchronizing the entire physical body,
Oh.
like the circulatory system,
Yeah.
the skeletal structure, everything to vibrate coherently at that 7 to 7.5 hertz range.
So it's like
So
it
it's
is-
like turning up the volume
Yeah. Wow.
on that micromotion.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And the idea is that by doing this, you're creating a sound wave that's in harmony with the Earth's electrostatic field.
So
So it's like you're really tapping into that resonance.
yeah, so then it goes on to talk about energy entrainment and then out-of-body movement. So how does resonance relate to this idea that our consciousness can kind of leave our body?
Well, so the idea is that by achieving resonance with the Earth's field, the body's energy field becomes more uniform with its surroundings.
Okay.
It's like, you think about like tuning forks.
Okay.
If you strike one tuning fork and you have another one nearby that's tuned to the same frequency,
Uh-huh.
it'll start to vibrate as well.
Right.
So it's kind of like the gateway process is trying to tune your energy field to the Earth's field.
Okay.
And by doing that, it's like you're creating this stronger connection between the two.
Okay. So then they're saying that this uniformity, this kind of blending of energy fields makes it easier for consciousness to kind of move out?
Yeah, that's the proposition.
Okay.
And they link this to the brain achieving a state of focus coherence at higher frequencies,
Uh-huh.
which they refer to as data collection,
Okay. So,
implying that you're collecting information beyond what your physical senses can normally pick up on.
okay.
Yeah. And they also suggest that raising the body's overall energy levels through this resonance could also contribute to out-of-body experiences.
Okay. And then there's this idea that when the body is kind of similarly tuned, it can act as a carrier wave for mind-to-mind communication.
Right.
So it's like we're a transmitter and a receiver of consciousness.
That's a really interesting concept, right? Like the idea that consciousness is not just a product of the brain,
Uh-huh.
but something that can interact with and potentially extend beyond the physical realm,
Yeah.
which kind of leads us to the next section of the paper,
Okay.
which delves into the fundamental nature of consciousness.
Right. So it talks about like the material world and how like matter and energy aren't really separate, distinct things like we perceive them to be.
Right, yeah, they're not as different as we think they are.
Right.
The paper emphasizes the scientific understanding that even subatomic particles like electrons and the nucleus
Uh-huh.
are actually composed of these oscillating grids of energy.
Oh,
So it's like even the most fundamental building blocks of matter
right.
aren't really solid in the way that we think of them.
Okay.
They're more like these very rapid vibrations.
Right. Okay, so the paper gives figures from Bentoff, and he has these different levels of organization that he looks at, right?
Right, yeah. He gives us some numbers to really wrap our heads around this.
Yeah.
He says that the atomic nucleus vibrates at like 10 to the power of 22 hertz,
Wow.
which is just mind-bogglingly fast.
Yeah, yeah.
And then it goes all the way down to a human cell vibrating at about 10 to the power of 3 hertz.
Okay, so like the takeaway here is that the entire human being, including consciousness, is this really complex system of energy fields.
Right, and the states of matter are just like different expressions of this underlying energy.
Oh.
Yeah, and then they go on to define human consciousness itself as a function of energy interacting in opposing states of motion and rest.
Right. And this brings us to the concept of a holographic universe.
Mm-hmm.
So how does this idea of oscillating energy relate to holograms?
Well, the paper explains that energy in the universe can create, store, and retrieve meaning
Uh-huh.
by projecting itself in three-dimensional form at specific frequencies.
Okay.
And that's basically what a hologram is.
Okay, so it's kind of like a pattern of energy.
Yeah, like a dynamic living pattern.
Okay.
Yeah, they even use this analogy from Bentoff, where he talks about dropping 3 pebbles into water
Okay.
and then instantaneously flash freezing the ripple pattern.
Okay, I'm following.
And then if you shine a coherent light source, like a laser, through that frozen ripple pattern,
Uh-huh.
it projects a three-dimensional image of the original pebbles.
Wow.
So it's like the frozen ripple pattern is holding the information of the pebbles
Right.
and projecting it out in 3 dimensions.
Right, and holograms can capture so much detail, right?
Yeah, an insane amount of detail.
Like they were talking about seeing microorganisms.
Yeah, in a holographic projection of swamp water
Yeah.
that weren't visible in the original sample.
Wow.
Yeah, the idea of holography was first developed by Dennis Gabor back in the 40s.
Okay.
But it wasn't until the laser was invented that we could actually demonstrate it.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But the crucial aspect is the interference pattern that arises when 2 laser beams interact,
Mm-hmm.
or when a laser beam is reflected off an object.
Okay.
And you can record this pattern and then use it to reconstruct a 3-dimensional image.
Okay, so like the hologram of a human face.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so one of the most significant properties of holograms is this idea that the part contains the whole.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah, so this is crucial for understanding the paper's arguments about consciousness.
Uh-huh.
So imagine you have a holographic plate and you break into a bunch of smaller pieces.
Okay.
Each individual piece will still contain the entire holographic image.
Really?
Yeah, although the clarity and resolution will be reduced.
Wow.
It's like each fragment holds a miniature version of the whole picture.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and to create a hologram, You need this interplay between energy that's in motion and energy that's at rest.
Right. So like in the pebble analogy, the
Exactly.
pebbles are the motion.
Yeah, the pebbles are the energy in motion, and the still water is the energy at rest.
Gotcha.
And then you need a coherent light source, like a laser, to pass through that interference pattern to activate the hologram.
Okay.
Yeah, and Marilyn Ferguson is even quoted in the paper emphasizing how efficient holograms are. Like they can store billions of bits of information in a tiny space.
Wow.
And the pattern is distributed throughout the whole medium.
Okay, so then if the universe is really just all these energy fields interacting,
Right.
then the paper says that the universe itself is this huge hologram.
Yeah, that's the big leap.
Yeah.
The idea is that the universe itself is one giant complex hologram.
Right.
And they draw upon the theories of Karl Pribram, who's a neuroscientist,
Right.
and David Bohm, who's a physicist.
Okay.
And they suggest that the human mind is also holographic in nature.
Okay.
So the idea is that this mental hologram aligns itself with the universal hologram through this constant exchange of energy. And
Okay.
that interaction is how we experience consciousness.
Okay, so if we enter an altered state of consciousness,
Right.
like the gateway process is trying to get us to, how does this holographic model explain what's going on?
Well, the idea is that as energy from the universal hologram permeates the electrostatic field of the mind,
Okay.
it projects holographic images onto that field.
Uh-huh.
And our ability to perceive those images depends on whether our mind's electrostatic field is operating at a frequency and amplitude that can harmonize with and read the incoming energy carrier wave.
Okay, so it's like tuning a radio.
Exactly, to pick up a specific station.
Okay, so then the fluctuations in our mental frequency determine
Right,
what we're receiving.
exactly.
Okay.
And then to make sense of those holographic images,
Uh-huh.
the mind compares them to its own internal holographic representation,
Okay.
which is our memory.
Right.
Yeah, and by identifying differences in geometric form and energy frequency,
Uh-huh.
we experience consciousness.
Okay.
Like we're constantly comparing the external hologram to our internal hologram.
Right.
And that process of comparison is what creates our experience of reality.
The paper quotes a psychologist, Keith Floyd. And he says, contrary to what everyone knows is so, it may not be the brain that produces consciousness,
Right.
but rather consciousness that creates the appearance of the brain.
Yeah, that's a pretty mind-blowing statement, right? Like
Yeah.
it flips everything on its head.
Yeah, it really does. So that
Yeah.
means that individual consciousness is part of this larger universal hologram.
Right. And if we can influence our consciousness field with different frequencies, like through the gateway process, we might be able to alter our perception, expand our awareness,
Yeah.
and tap into different frequencies of reality.
So then it talks about brain in phase.
Yeah.
How does this model describe consciousness in terms of the holographic input?
Well, the idea is that we can visualize holographic input as having a three-dimensional grid system superimposed on it.
Okay.
And this allows for the energy patterns to be described geometrically
Uh-huh.
and then mathematically reduced to a two-dimensional form.
Okay.
Yeah, and Bentov even proposes that the mind operates on a binary system like a computer.
Really? So like a go, no go?
Yeah, exactly, a go, no-go system.
Wow.
So the idea is that the mind superimposes this 3D matrix onto the holographic information, interprets it, and then reduces it to 2D so that it can be processed using this binary system
Okay.
through a process of comparison.
So he's saying that our whole reality is constructed by making these comparisons.
Right. Yeah, he's saying that whenever we perceive something, we're really just perceiving differences.
Wow.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, it is. So then what roles do the different hemispheres of the brain play in this holographic processing?
Well, the paper suggests that the right hemisphere, with its holistic, nonlinear, nonverbal mode of functioning, acts as the primary receiver of the holographic input.
Okay.
And then the left hemisphere, working in coherence with the right, provides a secondary matrix,
Okay.
using its binary computer-like function to further analyze the data and reduce it to 2D form.
So how does the paper assess like how effective the gateway process is?
Well, they conclude that to the extent the gateway can reinforce the mind's energy matrix, it'll also be successful in expanding or altering human consciousness.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this would enable perception without reliance on our physical senses,
Right.
which would give us access to a broader range of the universal hologram.
So Marilyn Ferguson says
Yeah.
that the theories of Pribram and Bohm could explain transcendental experiences, paranormal events.
Right. And even those normal perceptual oddities that we sometimes experience.
Right.
Yeah, she describes Pribram's model as this really all-encompassing model that bridges brain research and theoretical physics,
Wow.
and suggests that these experiences are natural phenomena, just like in quantum physics.
Yeah, that would change our understanding of a lot of things.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So the paper also talks about self-cognition.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, so the paper's trying to explain what distinguishes human thought from the consciousness that we observe in other forms of life,
Okay.
like plants and animals.
Right.
So the idea is that humans not only have awareness, but they also have meta-awareness,
What's that?
meaning that they know that they know. They're aware of their own awareness.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we can monitor our own thought processes. We can be consciously aware of them, and we can evaluate them against objective standards.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and the paper suggests that human consciousness achieves this by creating a duplicate of aspects of its own hologram,
Okay.
projecting it outward, perceiving that projection, and then comparing it with its own memory,
Gotcha.
which is where our evaluation standards are stored.
Okay, so we're like creating a mirror image
Exactly.
and looking at it.
Yeah, and by comparing the two, we gain this understanding of ourselves.
Okay, and this process uses 3 geometry and binary pulses
Right.
to result in verbal cognition about the self.
Yeah, it's like a very complex feedback loop
Okay.
that allows us to understand who we are.
And they use art as an example.
Right. Yeah, they highlight art as this uniquely human form of meaning creation and self-reflection. So it's like we're taking our internal experience and we're projecting it out into the world in the form of art.
Okay, so now this brings us to the time-space dimension.
Yeah.
This is where things get really out there.
Yeah, this is where it gets really wild.
So how does the gateway process aim to transcend the limitations of time and space?
Well, so the paper starts by defining time as a measurement of energy or force in motion.
Okay.
So it's a measurement of change.
Uh-huh.
And it requires some degree of confinement within a vibratory pattern
Okay.
to establish a specific location in space.
I'm following.
Yeah, so it's like time and space are kind of intertwined.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and then they contrast this with unconfined energy,
Okay.
which they describe as force without any limits or dimensions.
So like
Essentially infinity.
Yes, infinity. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and this unconfined energy can't move because there's nothing beyond infinity for it to move into.
Right.
So it's outside of the constructs of time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it's also beyond the concept of space because space implies defined locations and boundaries.
Right, so it's everywhere and nowhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And this energy in its infinite state is conscious force, the fundamental power of existence without any defined form.
Okay.
So it's a state of infinite being completely at rest
Okay.
and incapable of generating holograms.
Okay.
Yeah. It can passively perceive the holograms generated by the active universe,
Yeah.
but it can't be perceived by active consciousness.
So it's like a one-way mirror?
Yeah, kind of like that.
Okay.
Physicists call this energy in its absolute state or just the absolute.
The absolute. Okay.
Yep.
So the paper saying that there are all these intervening dimensions between this absolute and our material universe
Yeah.
that we can access in altered states.
Yeah, and theoretically, consciousness could even expand to encompass the absolute.
Yeah.
But at that point, perception would cease because the absolute doesn't generate holograms of itself.
Wow. So it's like we can get closer and
Yeah.
closer, but we can never really see it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like approaching the horizon.
Okay.
You can keep rocking towards it, but you'll never actually reach it.
Okay. So this idea of an underlying unity
Yeah.
connects to a lot of mystical traditions.
Right. Yeah, a lot of mystical traditions emphasize this idea of an underlying unity beneath all the diversity that we perceive.
Right.
And the idea that everything originates from or is differentiated out of this fundamental absolute state.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the absolute permeates every dimension, including time-space.
Right. It's everywhere, but we just can't perceive it directly.
Right. Okay.
And these intervening dimensions act as pathways for energy flowing to and from the absolute.
Okay.
Yeah. And to access these dimensions, the paper says you need an incredibly focused and coherent state of consciousness where your brainwave frequency is so high, it looks like a solid line on an oscilloscope.
Wow. Okay.
And this ties into the idea of Planck's distance from quantum mechanics.
Okay. What's that?
Well, Planck's distance is the smallest possible unit of length. It's like the smallest grain of reality.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And the idea is that any oscillating frequency will reach 2 points of complete rest,
Okay.
marking the boundaries of its oscillation. And at those infinitesimal moments of rest, energy clicks out of time-space and rejoins infinity.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and this happens when the speed of oscillation drops below Planck's distance.
Wow. So it's like the energy is disappearing and reappearing?
Yeah, so it's blinking in and out of existence.
Wow.
Yeah.
So Bentov says quantum mechanics tells us that when distances go below Planck's distance, we enter, in effect, a new world.
Right. And the paper suggests that as human consciousness reaches very high frequencies, these clickouts become so frequent
Okay.
that they create a virtual sense of continuity.
Okay.
And a portion of consciousness can then establish and maintain information collection in these dimensions
Wow.
that lie between time, space, and the absolute.
So the gateway process with HemiSync is designed to facilitate this.
Right. The idea is that HemiSync can help to create this coherent pattern of perception in these dimensions where speeds below Planck's distance apply,
Right.
whether your consciousness is in your body or out of your body.
Okay, so they use subatomic particles to illustrate this click out thing.
Right. They talk about how entangled subatomic particles seem to communicate with each other instantaneously across vast distances.
Right.
And this communication is thought to occur during the click-out phase of their energy oscillations.
Okay.
So it's like they're communicating outside of time-space.
Right, so it doesn't violate relativity.
Exactly, yeah. It's not breaking the speed limit.
Right.
Because it's happening outside of the realm where that speed limit applies.
They quote Dr. John Gleedman,
Yeah.
who talks about the Siamese twin effect.
Right, where entangled particles instantaneously respond to changes in each other, no matter how far apart they are.
So it's like they're connected beyond space and time.
Yeah, it's like they're two parts of the same whole.
Right. Okay, so then they talk about what reality is like beyond time-space.
Yeah, so Gontov suggests that in these dimensions, causal relationships start to break down.
Okay.
Movements might seem jerky or discontinuous, and time and space themselves become grainy or chunky.
So you could move through space without time passing.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very different reality than what we're used to.
That's wild.
Yeah.
So they say that once we go beyond time-space, we can access the past and the future.
Yeah, that's the implication.
Okay, so what's the special status of the out-of-body experience?
But the paper argues that while you can learn to move beyond time-space from within your body, it's much easier if you detach your consciousness from your body.
Okay, so an OBE.
Right, an OBE.
So why is that?
The idea is that when you achieve an OBE and then click out of time-space, you're starting from a base camp that's closer to those target dimensions.
So it's like you're getting a head start.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. It's like starting a race halfway through the track.
Okay.
So you don't have to run as far.
Okay.
And then once consciousness is projected beyond time-space, it tends to entrain its frequency with the new energy environment.
No.
Yeah, which enhances its focus and oscillating pattern.
Okay.
So it's like a self-reinforcing cycle.
Okay, so the farther you project, the more energy you have.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The farther you go, the easier it gets.
Okay, so OBEs are really effective for expanding consciousness.
Yeah, that's what the paper suggests.
Wow.
It seems like a faster and more profound approach than trying to do it from within the body.
Okay, so the paper wraps up by giving a perspective on the absolute.
Yeah.
So what is it?
Well, they remind us that the universal hologram is created by the interplay of energy patterns from all dimensions, including time-space.
Right.
And our minds are just energy fields that interact with this hologram to extract information, which is then processed by the left brain for conscious thought. And they say that this universal hologram is the active expression of the absolute's infinite consciousness in the form of energy. And the absolute itself is the vast pool of perfectly resting energy that underlies the physical universe.
So it's like the source of everything.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Bentov uses the analogy of the sea to describe this. So the still deep depths of the ocean represent the absolute.
Okay.
The turbulent wave-covered surface represents the physical universe.
Gotcha.
And the currents in between represent energy moving towards or away from rest.
I like that.
Yes, good analogy.
It is.
Yeah.
So then the paper goes into this model that Bentov has that tries to connect the Big Bang with the universal hologram as a torus.
Right. So his model is based on the idea that smaller processes in the universe often mirror larger ones. So he uses the example of electron orbits mirroring planetary orbits.
Okay.
And he envisions the creation of the universe as being similar to quasars ejecting beams of matter, which eventually form this ovoid or egg-like shape.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's some observational evidence for this, like the fact that galaxies in the north are moving faster than those in the south,
Oh,
and that galaxies in the east and west are more distant,
okay.
which suggests a jet of matter that's curved back on itself.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, so in this model, matter enters the ovoid through a white hole,
A white hole.
which is a compressed energy nucleus,
Uh-huh.
and then it exits through a black hole at the far end.
Okay.
And time, in this model, is the measure of change as energy evolves into more complex forms along the shell of this cosmic egg.
Wow. Okay.
So it's energy that's been expelled from infinity,
Uh-huh.
constrained by the consciousness of the absolute.
Right.
And then it gains form and motion as it emerges from the white hole,
Okay.
with time beginning as the cadence of this evolutionary journey towards the black hole.
So where are we in all this?
Well, the paper suggests that based on the distribution of galaxies,
Huh.
our universe is currently near the top of this egg-like structure, where matter is starting to fall back inward,
Okay.
which would explain why the galaxies in the north are receding faster.
So the absolute is layering over this cosmic egg.
Yeah, sustaining the radiating nucleus of the initial matter jet.
Okay.
And the movement of matter around the ovoid towards the black hole
Uh-huh.
generates the interference pattern within the cosmic egg,
Okay.
which constitutes the universal hologram, or torus.
The torus. Okay.
Yeah. And because the torus is generated by matter in all phases of time,
Uh-huh.
it reflects the universe's past, present, and future
Wow.
from our perspective, which
Right.
is limited to a single phase of time.
So human consciousness could access information about the past, present, and future?
Yeah. Potentially, if it's in a sufficiently altered or focused state,
Wow.
it could tap into this universal hologram
Okay.
and maybe even see the future.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
It is.
Yeah, the idea is that all these energy movements are leaving their mark on this hologram
And
and telling a story across time.
so it's like a recording of everything that's ever happened and will ever happen.
Yeah, it's like a cosmic history book.